Welcome to the deep dive. All right, you've handed us this stack of fascinating sources, transcripts from these recent Saturday Morning NeuroSim meetings.
hmm
Our mission today with you is really to jump into those discussions, navigate the complex ideas, and, well, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight.
Exactly. Think of this as a guided tour, maybe, through the cutting edge of how researchers are thinking about, well, everything from AI in the brain to computation, even the fundamental nature of life.
Okay.
We're pulling out the key debates, the surprising connections from these unique sources you've shared.
Great. So let's just dive right in then. One of the first things that really jumps out from these transcripts is this palpable tension, almost a rift, you could say, in the current landscape of AI and cognition research.
Absolutely, yeah. On one hand, the conversation around these meetings and, broadly in the field seems dominated by the success and focus on large language models, LLMs.
Right, they're everywhere.
They are. But the sources show there's this underlying persistent emphasis on deeper brain research and, well, traditional cognitive science. It's not just about building bigger models, it's about understanding the foundations.
Right. There's a moment described, for instance, where a panel featuring pretty prominent figures like Gershman and Tenenbaum was happening.
Yeah, I remember reading that bit.
And despite all the buzz around them being about LLMs, the panel itself was heavily focused on brain science development. As one voice in the sources put it, it felt like it had almost nothing to do with these LLMs.
And that really highlights a fundamental divide, doesn't it? You see cognitive science perspectives that strongly embrace embodiment.
Embodiment, the idea that intelligence is tied to having a body.
Exactly, tied to a physical body interacting with the real world. It's not just abstract computation.
Okay.
And contrasting with that, some voices in these discussions were described as being, well, pretty disinterested maybe in the role of human thought or language or even the biological brain itself.
That embodiment piece feels, well, crucial.
Yeah.
It pushes back against the idea that intelligence is just, code that can run anywhere. And this thinking is also shifting how researchers talk about AI benchmarks, right?
Exactly. The traditional tests like, winning at games or just processing language, they suddenly feel a bit insufficient.
Yeah.
There's discussion about ideas like the embodied Turing test, which suggests a better measure of general AI might be its ability to meaningfully interact with and navigate the physical world, not just pass a language test online.
Which naturally brings up fields like neuro-AI.
Yeah.
This isn't just trying to make AI do what humans do.
No, it's specifically trying to use the structure and function of the brain as direct inspiration for building artificial intelligence systems.
Okay, using the brain as a blueprint, kind of.
Precisely. And when you look at building those systems, the idea of representation is key. The sources mention exploring systems that integrate neural networks and cognitive architectures often called neurosymbolic systems.
So kind of merging the pattern recognition power of neural nets with the structured logic-based approach of traditional AI.
Yes, exactly. It's about creating models that have multiple levels of representation, hoping to capture both the intuitive pattern-based aspects of intelligence and the more symbolic rule-following ones.
Makes sense.
And cognitive architectures themselves, even the older boxes and arrows diagrams showing how different cognitive components connect. They're seen as a way to build more formal theories about how thinking actually works.
Okay, connecting those boxes and arrows, I noticed the concept of epistemic planning in the sources. That sounds complex.
It is a bit, but it's a fascinating extension of automated planning. Instead of just planning a sequence of actions to change the physical state of the world like a robot navigating a room,
Right.
epistemic planning asks how an agent gets from its current state of knowledge or belief to a desired state of knowledge.
So planning how to learn something.
Essentially, yeah, it's planning how to figure something out, how to gain understanding, not just how to move an arm or, navigate.
Planning for understanding. That really reframes things. Okay, so we've looked at the tensions in AI and cognition, the push for embodiment, new benchmarks, how systems represent and plan. Let's shift gears a bit and dive into how these discussions approach the brain itself.
Yeah, it's interesting how our understanding of the brain has been shaped by different metaphors over time. The sources mention the early idea of the brain as like a telephone switchboard,
Ah, yeah, I remember that one.
then later comparing it to the von Neumann computer.
And those metaphors failed, right?
Yeah.
Especially behaviorism struggled to explain something like language, that seemed way too complex for just simple stimulus response.
Exactly. That failure really drove the need for new theoretical models that could account for internal processes, for cognition.
Hmm.
Fast forward to more recent ideas discussed, like the shallow brain hypothesis. This challenges the idea of the brain as purely hierarchical.
Shadow brain.
How so? It suggests that the high-level cortical processing we often focus on is actually deeply integrated with massive parallel processing happening in subcortical areas.
So it's not just a chain of command from bottom to top. Like sensory input goes up, decision comes down.
No, it emphasizes the crucial role of loops, particularly between the thalamus and the cortex, constantly integrating information rather than just passing it up some strict hierarchy.
Huh. That's quite different from something like Rodney Brooks's subsumption architecture, which was also mentioned.
Very different.
Brooks's approach with robots, right?
Yeah,
Where you layer simple behaviors on top of each other instead of having one big, complex central plan.
precisely. It's another alternative model. And it differs from approaches like predictive coding or deep learning by not relying quite so heavily on abstract feature computation.
Got it.
But, regardless of the specific model, a huge challenge these researchers face is integrating the just explosion of neuroscience data.
Oh, I can only imagine. You've got everything from super detailed micron resolution data about cortical architecture
Yeah, tiny details.
to fMRI scans showing broad activity patterns, gene expression data, receptor density,
Yeah.
all sorts.
It's a flood of information at vastly different scales and types. And the difficulty is creating a unified data model to make sense of it all, to truly understand how the brain works.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It's tough. And the sources make a critical point here. Simply churning through massive data sets with algorithms isn't enough for mechanistic understanding. You need conceptual tools, frameworks, theories to actually interpret the data.
Data without concepts is just noise. Makes sense.
Essentially, yeah. And speaking of complex brain dynamics, the sources bring up brain spirals as a really fascinating example.
Brain spirals, like
Okay.
actual physical rotations in the brain tissue.
No, more like wave patterns, spiral-like rotations in the electrical signals, seen as slow fluctuations in the signal.
Okay, wave patterns.
What's interesting is they're thought to help organize activity flow, helping coordinate signals coming in from the senses, bottom up,
Right.
and signals from higher thought processes, top down during cognition.
Wow. So the brain isn't just static circuits firing. It has these dynamic, swirling patterns organizing information flow. That's wild.
It really highlights the brain as a complex, dynamic system. It's not just plumbing.
Okay, we've navigated the AI tensions, explored some models of the brain's structure and dynamics. This seems to lead us naturally to the broader themes of complexity science and how properties seem to, well, emerge from interacting parts.
Yes, this is where complexity science really helps. It gives us language to distinguish between looking at the brain and cognition from a global system perspective versus just focusing only on local component interactions.
And the classic example here is Gestalt psychology, right?
Yeah,
The whole Gestalt problem.
exactly. How do we see a constellation and a pattern of stars that are really just points of light? Or, a face in a cloud?
Yeah.
These are Gestalt's whole objects or
Yeah.
patterns that aren't simply the sum of their parts.
They have these key properties like non-additivity. The whole isn't what you get by just adding up the parts.
Right. And nonlinearity of the assembly isn't a simple linear process. And critically, emergence. The property of faceness in the cloud just sort of appears from the arrangement. It's not a property of any single bit of light or shadow.
Okay.
And the sources mention that researchers aren't just talking philosophically about this. You can use quantifiable measures in psychology experiments, things like reaction times or accuracy, to study how these emergent features seem to arise from component interactions in the brain during perception.
That's a tangible way to study something that feels almost magical sometimes.
Yeah.
But historically, thinkers like Sperry really pushed this idea, didn't they? Suggesting higher-order mental patterns might operate by their own laws,
Yeah.
sort of irreducible to the underlying neurophysiology.
Yes, exactly. This is the idea of strong emergence, where the whole doesn't just have new properties, but those properties can somehow exert a downward influence on the behavior of the parts.
Right, the mind affecting the brain cells directly, kind of.
It's a profound idea, but empirically demonstrating that kind of downward causation in a way that you can't just reduce back to the parts, well, that's proven very, very difficult.
Yeah, I bet. It challenges how we think about cause and effect across different levels. And this ties into the idea that biological processes happen across just vast differences in timescales.
Absolutely. Think about memory, for example. The sources mention memory reconsolidation,
Okay.
which involves biochemical processes happening right down at the synapse level.
Like calcium MK2 activity, I think they mentioned. Very specifics,
Yeah.
very fast processes.
Right. Tiny molecular machines doing their thing. When you retrieve a memory, the synapses involved briefly destabilize, that's the biochemical activity, and they restabilize. It's this dynamic dance happening on a very, very short time scale at the molecular level.
And yet, these incredibly short timescale biochemical events contribute to much longer timescale behaviors, like our ability to recall things over days or years,
Mm.
even our conscious experience of remembering something.
Precisely. And some of these underlying mechanisms are totally opaque to our conscious perception. You don't feel your calcium MK2 activating. Right?
No, definitely not.
But they have observable, profound effects on our behavior and ultimately who we are. It's all interconnected across these different
It
scales.
really makes you appreciate the layered complexity of the brain.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take another turn here. We've talked about computation and AI models and the brain, but what about computation happening? Well, everywhere else.
Yeah.
In physical stuff.
Right. This is the idea of physical computation. The sources discuss computation not just being confined to silicon chips or abstract algorithms, but potentially occurring in, well, materials or living systems.
Like bacteria or algae,
Yeah.
or even like fungal networks.
Yes. Specific examples given include reaction diffusion automata. These are theoretical models where simple cells update their state based on their neighbors, and collectively they can perform universal computation.
Wow.
And the truly wild one, exploring whether mycelium networks and, fungal networks can actually implement logic gates.
I'm still waiting for my mushroom computer. This idea that computation is somehow inherent in physics and biology. It reminds me of morphological computation. Is that related?
Exactly, very related. Where the physical form and properties of a system itself contribute directly to its ability to compute or control itself. Think about how different it is for a rigid robot arm to grasp something versus the incredibly flexible arm of an octopus,
Oh, yeah.
or just the dynamic balance a dog maintains with its whole body compared to a stiff robot.
So the octopus arm structure is doing some of the thinking or control work in a way. This is tied to neuromechanics, right?
Right, how the nervous system and the mechanical structure work together intimately. And this leads into even deeper territory, the connection to thermodynamics and the fundamental nature of life itself.
Schrodinger's idea about living systems being like islands of order in a sea of chaos.
Yes, essentially. Living systems are open systems. They decrease their internal entropy. They create order locally. But they do this by dramatically increasing the entropy, the disorder of their surroundings. They export disorder to maintain their own local order.
Right. Pay the entropy bill to the universe.
Pretty much. And the sources bring up Jeremy England's work here.
Okay, what's the key idea there?
Well, his work generalizes the second law of thermodynamics for systems driven by external energy, which includes living things, and his theoretical calculation for the minimum energy dissipation required for self-replication. It turns out to be remarkably close to what's actually observed in simple biological systems like RNA and bacteria.
Whoa. So life's ability to replicate and create order might be a kind of fundamental physical outcome of energy flow.
Mm.
That's a mind-bending idea.
It really is. It suggests a very deep link between physics and biology.
Mhm.
And the sources also discuss this complex relationship between energy and information control in biological systems.
Are they two sides of the same coin? Like, do energy-efficient synapses somehow naturally give rise to something like Bayesian inference?
That's one idea being explored. Or are they distinct processes, energetic control and informational control, that just interact very closely? The argument is made in the sources for really understanding their environmentally sensitive interaction. They influence each other.
So computation isn't just abstract math. It's physical, it's biological, it's tied to energy flow. It's kind of everywhere.
This is fascinating. Okay, let's think about how all this complexity unfolds over time, both in an individual's development and over evolutionary history.
Yeah, the journey from mere matter to mind, starting from a single cell and developing into a complex human, that's framed as a key area of inquiry. It involves gradual changes over evolutionary history and just significant remodeling during individual development.
Researchers think about this in terms of morphospace, right? This sort of theoretical space of all possible biological forms and developmental paths. How does life explore that space? Exactly. And the sources talk about tiers of biological cognition, suggesting cognition isn't just located in the brain, it exists at multiple scales. You have gene networks, the cytoskeleton within cells, then neural networks, organs, whole organisms, even groups of organisms.
Like the flatworm example I mentioned, you can cut it up, and each piece can regenerate a whole new worm, apparently complete with some memory.
Right. That suggests cognition or information processing is happening at a very fundamental, distributed cellular level. It's not all in a central processor.
Amazing.
Absolutely. And even within brain development, the importance of cell-cell interactions, or crosstalk, is highlighted how interneurons talk to glial cells, for instance.
And disruptions there.
Right. Disruptions in this essential communication during development are seen as potentially contributing to neurological disorders later on.
So problems at the sort of cellular communication level can cascade up and manifest as complex brain disorders.
Yes, it's layers upon layers of complexity building up. And finally, the concept of perspective learning comes up in this context.
Perspective learning, what's that about?
It's about linking the past, present, and future. The idea is that current models of learning might be too simplistic because they often focus just on immediate rewards or feedback.
Like reinforcement learning.
Yeah, often. Real-world learning, especially learning that happens across different scales and times, involves predicting and preparing for the future based on past experiences in the current situation. It's about learning for the future, not just reacting to the now.
So learning isn't just reactive, it's fundamentally proactive.
Hmm.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Hmm.
Okay, wow. We've covered a huge sweep of ideas here, from AI debates and brain dynamics to the physics of computation and how life develops. Let's finish by maybe touching on how researchers actually grapple with all this complexity, how it connects to current technology and, well, society.
Yeah, the sources are pretty honest about the challenges. It's genuinely hard to relate specific scientific facts to broader theories, and synthesizing knowledge across neuroscience, AI, physics, biology.
Hmm.
It's incredibly difficult. It really forces researchers to engage with the philosophy and history of science.
Right, it's not just doing experiments in a vacuum, it's thinking deeply about what it all means, how it fits together.
Exactly. And different approaches to theory building are discussed. Sometimes it's about clarifying existing ideas. Sometimes it's jumping into debates to refine concepts, trying to define terms clearly while avoiding, artificial distinctions that don't really hold up in reality.
Quantitative measures, of course, remain essential, as you'd expect. As the sources mention, psychology and neuroscience rely heavily on experiments with measurable outcomes to try and get a handle on these complex phenomena.
For sure. And we come back to that data challenge again. Managing and integrating the just immense diverse data sets in modern neuroscience is an ongoing struggle. It's definitely not a solved problem.
The sources give an example of how computational methods are applied to large data sets in a different field.
Yeah.
Educational data mining.
Right. Using statistics, algorithms, machine learning on student data to find patterns that might help with decision-making in education.
A real-world application of wrestling with data complexity. And a crucial point these researchers emphasize, according to the sources, is the importance of identifying and discussing open problems in a field.
Yeah, that came up a few times.
Why is that considered so important?
Well, it helps guide research towards tackling the truly fundamental questions, rather than just focusing on incremental results that might be easier to publish. It keeps the field honest, maybe, and focused on the big picture challenges.
That makes sense. Keeping the eye on the prize. Okay, shifting gears to technology, there's obviously huge excitement and hype around virtual reality, VR, augmented reality, AR, and extended reality, XR. Stuff like the Apple Vision Pro.
VR, AR, XR. Yeah, these are the technologies aiming to blend the digital and physical worlds. But the sources note there's still this ongoing challenge, finding truly practical, everyday use cases beyond gaming and entertainment. How do they become genuinely useful tools for everyone, not just cool gadgets?
Right. And technically, what makes these experiences actually work? What are the hurdles there?
Well, a key piece is creating spatial maps, or world meshes, basically. A detailed digital map of your physical environment that the technology can interact with.
So the headset knows where the walls and furniture are.
Exactly. But generating and maintaining those maps accurately in real time is still computationally very demanding.
Right. The system needs to constantly understand the room you're in. And to
Yeah.
make it feel really real, you need more than just visuals and sound, right? Haptics.
That's where haptic devices come in, trying to simulate the sense of touch and material properties. The sources mention some innovative designs, like origami-based haptics.
Origami-based.
Huh. Yeah, often linked back to robotics research. How do you make a virtual object feel rough or heavy or squishy? It's a hard problem.
Okay, so the technology is advancing rapidly, but there are still significant technical hurdles and questions about everyday utility. What about broader societal implications, especially with AR maybe?
Well, the potential downside is immediately apparent to many, being just overwhelmed by advertising layered directly onto reality.
Yeah, walking down the street and seeing pop-up ads on buildings.
Exactly. The sources explicitly connect this to dystopian visions from, cyberpunk fiction, and they highlight the need for careful, proactive regulation of these technologies before they get too far ahead of
That
us.
feels very real and very urgent. And speaking of technologies raising big questions, generative AI LLMs, image generators is obviously huge right now.
Absolutely massive. It brings up critical questions about generating content that's indistinguishable from reality, the nature of creativity itself, the ethical use of AI in science, art, journalism, pretty much everywhere.
Is this a totally new kind of intelligence we're seeing with LLMs? Or just very sophisticated pattern matching?
Well, some criticisms mentioned in the sources suggest they're primarily based on scaling up existing principles and finding patterns in vast amounts of data, rather than being a fundamentally new replacement for human expertise or genuine invention.
Okay. And there was a really thought-provoking, maybe slightly alarming idea mentioned about cultural evolution.
Yes, the potential for a kind of dilution of diversity.
Yeah.
The idea is if LLMs are trained on human-created content,
Right.
and then their generated content starts flooding the internet and enters the data pool,
Okay.
and then new models are trained on that mix of human and AI content, this iterative process could potentially lead cultural output away from genuine novelty and towards a kind of increasingly sophisticated imitation over time, a feedback loop.
That's a fascinating, slightly unsettling thought. AI not just reflecting culture, but potentially homogenizing it or steering it in weird ways.
It's definitely an active area of concern and discussion. And finally, the sources touch on AI's potential for controlling complex systems.
Comparing something like Project Cybersyn, that historical attempt in Chile back in the 70s,
Yeah.
to use computers to manage the economy.
Right, that early cybernetic dream.
Contrasting that with critiques like those in James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State.
Exactly. Highlighting the inherent unpredictability of large, complex human systems and the potential, sometimes unintended, consequence that attempts at centralized algorithmic control can lead more towards surveillance and brittle simplification than effective, nuanced management.
So even with incredibly powerful AI, controlling large complex systems remained incredibly difficult and fraught with potential issues.
Yeah. All these diverse areas, from the philosophy of mind and physics to cutting-edge tech and societal impact, they're all interconnected and actively being explored by the researchers in these sources you shared.
It's a truly deep, entangled landscape of inquiry.
It really is.
Wow. Okay, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive into your NeuroSim transcripts. We started with those current tensions between AI and brain science, explored models of brain dynamics, the challenge of integrating all that data, wrestled with complexity and how properties emerge across scales.
Yeah.
We considered how computation seems to be physical and biological, linked to thermodynamics, looked at development and learning over time, and finally touched on the methods and technologies shaping these fields, from VR to generative AI and its implications.
You've gotten a really rapid but hopefully informed perspective on a huge interconnected set of ideas that are truly at the frontier of research right now.
Absolutely. And it really makes you stop and think. Considering how deeply computation, biology, and even fundamental physics seem to be interwoven, and given the immense challenges of bringing together knowledge from all these different scales and disciplines, here's a provocative thought maybe for you to take away. What does it really mean to understand something as complex as intelligence? Can we ever fully capture it with just one model or approach? Or is the very act of trying revealing something fundamental about the universe itself?
It's the question, isn't it? Driving so much of this research forward.